Hi, and welcome back to the Dossier Project. We have been discussing the traits that make a DOS woman, or daring you to develop the traits to become more like a DOS woman. And we have done, I think, 10 or so traits now. We're rounding home base. We are doing vulnerability today. We're going to discuss the aspects of vulnerability, what it is, share maybe vulnerably with you, and then um, and then we have one last trait before we round out our year's challenge of the making of a DOS woman. So without further ado, ladies, what is vulnerability? What is vulnerability and what is your experience of vulnerability?
So yeah, definitely vulnerability is not something that I personally like much or practice much or do much. I tend to be someone who's much more you know, toughen it up and deal with it and don't, show yourself as much and kind of just deal with it. But I think for me vulnerability is showing yourself. It's being honest, it's opening up yourself. So yeah, showing yourself in with all your fallibilities and rawness. So there's a rawness to for me in vulnerability, something that's very authentic. There's no pretense, there's no politeness, there's no fear so much in it. It's just kind of just being yourself, showing yourself without any filters, without any I guess masks, as some people would say, or whatever it is. That's vulnerability, and I think it is something that we don't really practice much in society, in our world, because it's, I think, often confused with weakness, with failure, with fallibility, with things like that. So I think it's something that we learn from very young not to be vulnerable, not, to toughen up and to not show your feelings. And so I think vulnerability does have something to do with honestly showing your feelings, your thoughts, your perspective, your opinion, those kind of things. So it's not something that I think we foster in general in schools or universities or workplaces. So that's I think about vulnerability.
When I have a way to get into what I call a vulnerable state. And I think what you're saying, Sahaj, is so true. We're so used to go, 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 go. Like this society these days, it's like you need to be on the move. You need to be doing stuff. You need to be, and that's how we are measuring our success externally, right? In society, it's like, how much have you achieved? How much have you done this week? And I feel that way a lot too, even, just in my day to day as a mom. And then I purposefully was like, let me breathe a couple of times before I share what I think vulnerability is. And it's more of a feeling than a thought to me. And yes, I agree. It has a lot to do with how I am sharing my, could be thoughts, it could be sometimes feelings, it could be, sometimes saying I love you is really vulnerable depending to who I say it. And yes, it's a tougher one for me as well. And I agree that it is probably because I haven't practiced it that much. I have practiced a lot of more of the appearance, and I'm saying this even as a child, right? Like it's a training in a way on how we do life, and it depends on where you're being raised and whatever. But there are certain traits that I feel like, oh yeah, I have this really well trained. This one, it's kind of more recent. It has had a lot to do with my meditation practice. It had a lot to do with just sitting and letting these feelings just stir in myself. And maybe from there I can share more vulnerably. I know we shouldn't be describing the thing while naming the thing, but that's, you know, that it just feels like a more raw sharing of my opinions and my emotions and my thoughts. So
When you mentioned that it flies in the face of politeness, like it was interesting when you said, oh yeah, and it's not, you know, it's not polite, it's just raw. It was interesting. I felt all of a sudden my heart started beating a little faster, and I was like, oh wow, that's a mask I use. I do this polite thing instead of really rawly sharing how I feel, like worrying about how what I'm going to say or how I deliver it or my tone is going to affect somebody. It's not to say don't be considerate, but there is a bit of a mask I wear that when you pointed it out, I was like, oh, there's a little nervousness to take that one away. Okay, interesting. So I think that's just an example for me of one of the ways that I can cover up the vulnerability. I mean, I think there's many ways that I do that, and I think actually through the Dossier Project, through this, it's kind of been like a practice of identifying all the ways in which I cover myself, you know, all the ways in which I avoid vulnerability. And it's kind of like I had to do that first and become aware of that before I could start to really lean into the vulnerability or become aware of when I am and when I'm not. Yeah, and it's still something I have to intentionally lean into, for sure.
You know, I'm like having very rapid thoughts with everything you are sharing because I completely agree being vulnerable is raw, but then I thought like, why? And there's something that it feels like you can be hurt. When you think about vulnerability as just like the vulnerability in like anything, you know, you've got a warship. What's its vulnerabilities? It's like it's where it can be hurt. It's where it is weak, right? So my vulnerability is where I'm weak, where I can be hurt. And I also agree that vulnerability as an expression is showing my authentic self. So that's kind of weird to me. Why is it that being authentic somehow makes me weak? But the truth is, of course, it does not make you weak, but we feel like it does. And it feels like if I'm authentic and I put myself, my genuine self out there, and you reject me, like, oh, shot to the heart, right? It somehow feels like way worse than if I'm putting on my mask, my polite mask, my like educated mask, my, you know, confident mask, like whatever those things are, and you reject me then, like, well, whatever. It's not really me. You know, I can sort of feel like insulted, but it's not the same as like a really deep, like you've rejected like the core of me feels painful, not just like, oh, insulting. So, but then I was going even further because I was like, you know, there are times though that I'm not vulnerable. Like if you move through the vulnerability where I show who I am to the world and I accept it fully, you keep going to a point of invincibility where it's authentic and it's raw, but it's not vulnerable anymore because I accept me. And if you reject me, that part of me, it's who I am. Like, and I've come to peace with that. So it's really, I'm just sort of having like these like, whoa, like connections of like the vulnerability, that part where you're just showing it, but you haven't fully like, I don't know, settled into it in yourself is really, really scary. But once it's settled in, oh my gosh, like it's a superpower because I'm imagining a few different things. I had memories coming up of, you know, one time expressing myself to someone who I thought was very safe. And I said something like in my mind is like a little bit, I don't know what the word is. Like it was very like a physical kind of raunchy thing to say. And that's not something I normally would say, my mask. And I said it. And I remember the person kind of like reared back and I felt rejected. And I felt really unsettled by the experience, you know? But now I'm looking back and I'm like, well, that was their thing that they were reacting to. And then I just hadn't really accepted that part of myself. Like, okay, I can sort of see it with more objectivity. And then I have another memory of somebody came to me and they were in quite a state. And I looked at them and I was like, I think I know what you're feeling. You're feeling that part where you give your heart to someone and you do something for them, and then they read it the wrong way, like in a romantic sense. They read it the wrong way and they reject you. And I accept that part of myself that I like give in a certain way. And I said to them, like, it's so hard because you're doing this, and then all they see is that, you know, they see that you're just encroaching on their space, but here's you just trying to, you know, be with them, right? And the both of us were just like bawling together, and it felt like me accessing my vulnerability in a way that I accepted it allowed me to help her access the vulnerability and accept it and maybe move through it. So anyways, these are all the rapid thoughts that are coming into my head with everything that you guys have started with. And yeah, it's amazing. Like, it's important and it's beautiful.
I agree with all what you guys are saying. It's just like thinking about, and I'm think there's a certain feel to the vulnerability, and at first it feels like that it almost, if I say, like, I'm kind of tonal sometimes, it feels like a whisper, like feels like a tender, you know, like, here's me, you know, and I'm like just sharing me, and it's like, you know, I feel like I might be, you know, get hurt or at risk and stuff. Like there's like a whisper to it, like a quiet, and it's not like vulnerability is not like screaming out to the world and be like, ah, you know. But then there's the other side that has like a feeling of, I call it the vulnerability of just taking a risk, right, of something that can feel not like a whisper, like, and maybe something that I'm not comfortable with sharing, or it could be like, sometimes I think like what's vulnerable, what's not vulnerable, like is oversharing, like sharing or oversharing like things, you know, sometimes it could be like whatever, something personal or something private or something maybe like showing off your body or something in a way that can be, but it depends on like, I don't know, it's not necessarily the act, and it could be different for each person. You know, just sharing something that's maybe personal and private, even if it's like on social media, can feel very vulnerable to me because I'm typically a more private person. And versus another person might show a picture of them scantily clad in a bikini or whatever, and they think like, oh, that's vulnerable. Like maybe not, because they, you know, totally feel comfortable sharing, you know, that kind of, it's to each their own, and it's kind of coming from a different way. And that where sometimes the vulnerability could be sharing like intimate things where I'm at risk of showing my true self and being rejected or judged or something like that quietly, or it can be like, here am I, like sharing something that I've been like working on and don't know if any, you know, people will judge me, but I'm going to share it anyway, you know, share it with the world on social media, something that I've been working on that, you know, privately, and maybe you never knew about me, whatever. You know, it could be, here's a painting I painted, like, you know, whatever. And here it is, you know, showing it, you know, and kind of like, you know, and people will say and judge it sucks or whatever. All of that could be vulnerable too. But I do think there's a commonality of like not putting up those guards or pretenses or image so that you appear strong, but like letting yourself be at risk of judgment, rejection, you know, and this is something either something that I'm doing or sharing that feels personal, private, intimate, that, you know, with other people. And it could be with an individual, like physical intimacy or whatever, or it could be with the whole world, depending on, it feels like I'm putting myself out there.
Yeah, I think it definitely has like a aspect of bearing or sharing or showing something that you don't normally or usually show and bear, you know. So it's something that's kind of a awareness, and it does seem like a part just that's like exposing yourself, you know, like being naked. Like there's no cover up, there's no frilling of it, there's no you know, elaboration, exaggeration or whatever, or it's just very kind of, yeah, raw and yeah.
No, I was thinking about that word like all the time, like exposed. That's how it feels like. It feels like you're exposed. But it is interesting what Leah was saying about like, yeah, why? Like, why do we feel that way? And wondering, I think for me in DOS, I was thinking, it's like, well, how did I learn? Because I did feel that I could be myself. Like I did feel like I could bring things that were, I wasn't speaking about them, often, and I could bring them to my person, to my master, and they would listen, and it's like it did feel exposed, but in a way it was kind of like, it was like a safe space to be kind of like, okay, I'm accepting this about myself. I feel like I got to know myself much more. And by that, I was able to be like, okay, well, yeah, I guess I do like this, or I don't like this. For me, it was, I have a lot of what it's called the accommodating patterns. So I would try to fit in, and I would try to say like, yeah, I like this or that. And in reality, when I looked into myself, I mean, there's something like super silly, like my family hates puzzles. I love puzzles. And it's something that I've kind of like hid, for a while, because like they don't like it, and I do feel rejected. Like every time I'm like, does anybody want to do a puzzle? And they're like, no. So it's, but it was so, it like a sweet moment too, where I was able to be like, you guys, like I do like puzzles. I'm gonna start doing puzzles by myself, and it's very rewarding. It was vulnerable, and I know it might sound like a little silly or whatever, but it did take me a little bit to figure out that I liked something that they didn't, and that it didn't mean anything other than I like other things. So doing them on my own too, I feel like that's also been interesting. And it is vulnerable, but it's so sweet too. I'm like, well, yeah, I love it. And I've been working at a puzzle for the past year, and I haven't been able to finish it yet. But like every time that I have even a little bit of time, like I go and try to find a piece, and it's just so soothing for me, I guess. So could have many faces, this vulnerability.
Yeah, I think there's something about when you were saying the sharing in that safe space within DOS, it was like, and I think it was like, why is that? And it's like this intimate relationship you have with this person that's yeah, intimate, because you're sharing like true things, like no judgment kind of. And also there's something to the fact that you make a commitment, and like what you say and share with them, they're not going to be like, okay, I'm out of here, we break up. It's not like flippant like that. And so that you're in there for the long, no matter what, there seems like you're more open to share that because you've made a vow commitment, and it's not a light one, so that it's they're somehow related, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, because why do we wear a mask? We wear our mask because we think someone's going to walk away from us, or we're not going to have that interaction anymore. Or we're not going to have, I mean, sometimes we're dependent on the people that we wear the masks with. Could be a boss, could be a parent, could be a friend, but whatever it is, we feel dependent on that person for something, even if it's, maybe you don't have that many best friends, and you've shared so much of yourself with this person, and what if they walk away, or what if they do reject you? Then, you don't have that same friend anymore. I think in general, my patterns are more perfectionist. So I learned as a young child that I needed to be perfect to be loved, or I thought that's the reason I was loved, or how I got it. So starting to be vulnerable, like starting to admit failures, or like even starting to admit to myself how I, like, where I'm struggling, or things like that. That alone was a process. I remember having these conversations in the Dossier Project when we first started doing this, and it was horrifying to me. Like I'd see myself on screen, and I was like, and then I'd be like, and I'm sharing, and I'm like robotic, and I'm this, but I was just so scared. I mean, besides the fact that we were being, like watched with a spotlight and judged and like turned into like brainwashed twits and whatever else people were doing, I mean, like all the things right on top of my perfectionist stuff. But man, if you want to pull down a few layers of veneer, then I think this is a good process for sure.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking like, and also what Leo was saying, vulnerability in many ways. I think there's a reality of us having a physical vulnerability, meaning like to death and fire and, like physical things that can physically really like kill us or, damage us, and we're very vulnerable to them. But I think there's so much emotional and psychological vulnerability that we all carry around, but that's essentially very made up, meaning we're scared of the rejection, we're scared of the consequence, we're scared of losing the relationship, we're scared of losing the job, whatever it is. And that's the vulnerable, like there's a fear there of like, if I show my rawness, my realness, my failures, then I'll be rejected, I'll be fired, I'll be dumped, whatever it is. So I think we do all of these things because we're so fearful of the consequences, but they're exaggerated. Like they're not like, yes, they hurt us, but they don't really hurt us, meaning like we don't die, we don't have a like a cut or anything like that. Like it's rough and we process it, but we come through it. So I think a lot of the vulnerability that we avoid is very psychological and emotional, and we just don't test it. It's like the elephant that never moves from the chain as an adult, because as a child he was, tied down with the stake, and he never tries to escape again. As an adult, he could easily remove the stake, and escape, but he never tries. And I think we're similar like that. We, as children or younger people, got rejected and felt hurt, and it felt, we got made fun of, or we showed something, or we shared something, and the kids laughed or whatever, teased us. And so I think we just learned again, in our society, just to not show those things, to try and protect ourselves from something that at the end of the day, all it is, it doesn't feel good. But I think it's way more blown up than in reality is at stake.
That brings up so much for me.
Mm.
Oh my gosh, just listening to you say that, because I thought where you were going to go was to make the distinction between emotional vulnerability and physical vulnerability. And I see those as two very different things. And you did make that distinction, but you went a step further, which brought up a whole bunch of my fears. But, so there is the physical, which I think is very true. We do need to protect ourselves physically. We're in a physical body. We're mortal, and a lot of people don't want, it's vulnerable to experience that we are mortal and we are in a physical body. And if we don't take care of it, we could die, or we don't take care in general, we could put ourselves in a situation that is difficult. And emotionally, being rejected or having a broken heart is not going to kill you. You actually don't die from those things. And to your point, Leah, like if you do accept you don't have control over other people, or you don't have control over circumstances, and you build your self-esteem that you can adapt to these things, there becomes an invincibility of like, I can be me, I accept me, and I'm good. But the place, Sahaja, where you went was like this combination of the two. Like as soon as you started talking about like, well, if you show yourself to your boss, or you show yourself and you lose your job, like that to me still borders on physical vulnerability. Like I lose my job, I can't make money, I can't feed myself, I die. I mean, it's, obviously there's a few steps before that happens, but and I guess it's everybody's line, right? Like where do you sell out? What I'm saying? Like, I mean, and we were all put in the position where do we be vulnerable and tell the truth and experience the effects of that? And a lot of them can seriously be destructive physically. I mean, my life is very different today than it used to be materially 7 years ago. And there are real realities to the fact that I can't do some of the things I would have been able to do in the past, that are like fix my teeth, do medical stuff, take care of my parents' health. Like there are things in a physical way. But again, I guess there's still an emotional component to that. Like it feels vulnerable to accept that we're mortal. I'm going to lose my parents. I'm going to lose my health eventually. And those are the harder things. I guess that's where, you know, if I really check in, like that's the thing to accept then that I'm protecting or avoiding.
I feel like there's an expectation that we have, and that can feel vulnerable. And I was thinking, it's like, well, vulnerability, it is what it is, right? Like I think we're so much more vulnerable physically than we actually like really think about. Like the amount of accidents, like car crashes that people die on, we know it's staggering, and it takes much more lives than, you know, anything else. I don't go into my car feeling like I'm vulnerable, you know, in that way, and I am. So there, I feel like there's this very clear distinction about like, okay, physically we are vulnerable, but then we have expectations of a lifestyle. We have expectations of the way that we think we can or may live our lives, and that does, it feels like it touches the physical vulnerability, but it doesn't, right? Like we can still be alive, and you know, there's millions of people in poverty, and you know, some places extreme poverty, and their will of living and their experience of life is so, I mean, it's, I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but I have, and it's just amazing how it doesn't matter, you know, in that sense. Like, yes, they are struggling with certain things, but this tags along with joy, actually. Their experience of living, it is very alive. It's very purposeful. It's very, you know, it can be. So, yes, I agree that we have an expectation, and I think expectations can stop us from being vulnerable. And being vulnerable, I feel like there's a lot to it where it's like, this is just where we're at. And, you know, do we want to do something about it? And it can be painful. I think that's a distinction that I was making too. It's like, oh, all those things like being exposed, being like, you know, and with kids now, I feel like there's a lot of, you know, you called me so and so, and now I feel hurt. And, you know, I feel vulnerable. But that, you know, no, I also feel like we need to be more resilient in that way. So we can move along to the other one.
Yeah.
The other trait.
Yes, yes. I think that's a great segue. We do have one last trait in our making of a dossier woman. And I will leave you all hanging, although Angie just teased you with it. And is there any final closing comments on vulnerability that anybody would like to make before we close this trait?
Go out and be more vulnerable.
I know, if you guys feel your heart starting to beat a little faster with anything we talked about, go ahead and lean into that. There's a lot of freedom on the other side for sure. All right. Well, it was wonderful chatting with all of you again. All of you at home, we would love to hear from you. We would love to hear your questions, love to hear the things that you feel vulnerable over or want to be able to accept more in yourself and move from the fear to the invincibility. So please do share those things with us. And again, if this was helpful, go ahead and share it. If you like it, like it. If you have not subscribed, please do. And we would love to be able to keep making these videos for you. So have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the last trait.